Now here's a very interesting piece of artwork called the Wilton Diptych. This is Richard II, King of England for about 20 years. This is his patron Saint John the Baptist. This is Edward and Edmund, prior kings of England, who by this time are being regarded as saints. You can see these halos above their heads. The king is being presented by John the Baptist to the Virgin Mary and the baby Jesus and a whole host of angels. This is a portable altarpiece. Larger ones like this would have been permanent fixtures in churches, but this is only about maybe 20 inches by 2 feet wide. And this in the middle is actually a hinge. So this folds up like a book into something that's about 20 inches by a foot wide. This would be carried wherever the king would go, and it could be set up on a table to be more or less an altar at which he would worship. By placing the king in juxtaposition with these revered figures and the deity, it was a way for the king to associate himself in his mind and in the mind of others with this kind of continuing presence of the deity. It's an example of egg tempera painting taken to the extreme. A lot of craftsmanship being shown here in how this shading is being done to show some texture in the cloth. Here, the same sort of shading, which is difficult to do with egg tempera. I've given you a write-up that I extracted from various places and put together on this to show you some elements of the extreme amount of detail here. The detail inherent in this coloration of the faces, difficult to do in this medium. The detail of the ruler's cloth, this is very, very detailed. When you look at it up close, it's almost microscopic how detailed the pigments are applied in this way to put here not just a smattering of a sort of a pattern to it, but actually a very fine replication of the woven cloth. And the same here. I included a scene from this area and Edmund's head to show you the way that the artist has worked at a very close scale to replicate extreme detail, which once again may add to the realism of it, because these are all in the same plane. There's no real sense of depth here where something behind would be expected to be a little more fuzzy. This is another example of what's called a Book of Hours, an illuminated book that would show different seasons of the year. This is a season where people of the aristocratic class who would have these kinds of clothing might be going on an outing in their finery. And so this, once again, being tempera, is a tough medium to work with. We're seeing here in the foreground this close attention to details. In fact, the Limbourg brothers were very famous for this, for working very, very closely in detail with very fine brushes to create scenes that you look closer and closer and closer and you still can't see anything very fuzzy in it. You can examine this and see that all of those little patterns are very fully replicated. These might be fleur-de-lis on here or other type of decorations, and the fine work here. So what we're seeing here is an element of realism based on extreme detail. Now we sort of get the impression here that this is off in the distance because in fact it is drawn just a bit fuzzier. But although this represents realism as seen by the eye, the more we look at this, the more we see this screen of trees is just kind of phony. It's just sort of the way we think trees might be, but it's not particularly realistic, especially these trunks. They all seem to be kind of pattern bookish. And here, when we look at the town, we really don't see any element of perspective in this. It's a bunch of spires and various things to hint at a town in the background. So this is exploiting detail in a difficult medium, egg tempera, but it's a stepping stone on the way to what was to come later in the Renaissance, later on in the 15th century and beyond, where realism was actually a goal that artists consciously sought. And eventually, what permeated the culture of the artist was a knowledge of at least 5 types of perspective, which is really something that we'll be taking a look at in Unit 4. This is just a detail of the illustration that I showed you earlier, and you can see here something of the extreme amount of precision and detail in the way that these were drawn. Pisanello. This is kind of a crazy thing. Studies of monkeys. There's 2 reasons I think this is kind of interesting. First of all, it's another instance, just like you saw an elephant at the end of the prior chapter, where the artist is not drawing something from a pattern book. But here he's actually doing what we might think a modern artist would do with a sketchbook, and that is drawing something that they hadn't seen before, just to try it out to see how they might represent this, how they might be able to capture the essence of this rather strange thing for which no pattern book example existed. The monkeys were probably rather rare in Italy where Pisanello lived, and when he saw one, it was not something that he would have had any guidance on how to draw. So this is a sketch. Now, the other interesting thing about this is silver point. What is silver point? Well, I've given you a write-up on that as well. It's a very interesting artistic technique, came in and out of favor in the Renaissance and in the 18th century, and there are still a few adherents to it. It's a very interesting way that drawings are made on a prepared piece of paper using simply a stylus that may be silver or some other metal. So why does silver being dragged across paper cause this sort of a fine line to be done? It's almost like we would think you might use a pencil for that. Well, a pencil, of course, you can write on unprepared paper, but the paper or the surface that was used to take a silver point was prepared in such a way that the dragging of the silver point across it would actually cause a difference in the surface that would cause a line to appear. Interesting thing about it, unlike graphite or lead pencils, this will not smudge. The line is made there in a very fine way. As fine a tip as you want to make is as fine as the line will be, and it won't smear or smudge. That's why this illustration, even though it might have been handled in the many hundreds of years since it was created, doesn't have the same kind of smudges on it that chalk or paper with pencil marks on it would have. So two things going on. The subject matter, not having a pattern to follow, so actually having to take it in with the eyes and then try to capture it as realistically as the object that's being pictured, and the technique of silver point being used to create very fine line drawings, and the spacing of the lines being used, closely spaced lines here to make the surface dark, lighter here, and then very light, widely spaced lines there. So a real skill involved in representing this kind of a chiaroscuro effect of light perspective, brighter here where the light is shining on it, shading over to a darker, being done in this medium where the artist had to really pay attention to how dense he made these lines in order to cause that effect to happen. And this is the end of slides for Chapter 11.